Thank you, everybody, for joining. Today is a pretty exciting day for me because I think we've all heard about the killer bees. Today, we've got the killer Jays. We've got John, Jay, and Jim, and a Jansen thrown in at the end. So pretty excited about the lineup today. But all joking aside, we're joined by three individuals who bring a tremendous amount of experience from a board perspective. They've forgotten more than I'll ever know about this subject. And the breadth and depth and the different types of boards that these gentlemen have participated in is pretty amazing. And I think it'll be very, very informative for the group on the line to hear their views on what a year in the life of a board member entails. So I'm not going to take up much more time than that. I will do introductions quickly as we introduce our panel. John Hawkins is the former vice chair of Odgers Berndtson. He also ran Russell Reynolds' board placement function. More importantly, he was my friend and mentor for a couple decades. He's one of the most genuinely nice people you'll ever meet, networked like crazy. He's got 16 gears up here I aspire to have someday. And he's recovering from a knee surgery, and he still agreed to join us today. So very, very appreciative of John joining. Jim Geraghty is an icon in the rare disease world. He worked with Henry Tamir at Zensights, then went over to Sanofi, where he did some strategic work when they got the big bear hug. And then he currently is the chairman of 3 biotech companies and also sits on the board of a couple others. Tremendous experience. Started his career as Bain as a consultant, a Yale law degree, and a master's in psychology, which, as we were discussing earlier, is probably more important than everything else combined. But very, very fortunate to have Jim join us on the call. Jay Galeota has been a friend for many, many years. Jay currently is on 6 different boards, 2 public, 2 private, and 2 nonprofits. Jay used to be president of Merck, Sharp and Dohme, and then transitioned over to run a generic house, G&W Labs, and then went over to Inheris as a spin out of Nectar as a CEO. Again, tremendous breadth and depth of experience, and more importantly, another great guy. He's also a proud father of 2 sons and a daughter, and he does a lot of work for our veterans as well. So very, very happy to have all 3 of these icons join us. And I thought we'd start today by turning it over to John Hawkins to share his perspective of what a typical year in the life of a board member looks like. So John.
Okay, well, thank you for that, Bob. Wonderful introduction, and welcome everyone. Some of you probably attended the session we had last December on how one goes about getting on boards, and I was fortunate to be a small part of that. So let's say that today you've now just been nominated and you're elected a director. So the question that now confronts you is, what's next? And I'm sure that day will come in the lives of many on this call. You recognize in signing up for a board opportunity like the one you may be seeking, or maybe even already have, is you're typically in for at least a 3-year assignment, and in some cases it can be a whole lot longer. It can be 10 years, and in some cases I've known directors who've served for decades. So recognize I won't say it's a marriage, because it's not. But it's a long-term commitment. It's a commitment to an organization and to a participation in something that, should it go well, and usually it does, you'll be proud to be part of it and involved for a very, very long time. So I'm going to let Jim in a minute talk about the role of a director and some of the responsibilities that go with that. But to address what Bob's asked me to undertake this afternoon, I'm going to talk about really what does a year look like. And board service, there's a rhythm to board service, with a couple of exceptions. The exceptions being an activist investor decides to take a large position in your company, someone decides to acquire your business, you have a massive adverse event that affects your valuation and your portfolio. These are not normal times for board members, as we all know. But in the typical year, what does a board calendar look like? And what I would say to you is it's all built around the annual meeting. The annual meeting is kind of the event that triggers, that culminates and triggers, culminates a year before and triggers a year to come. And following the annual meeting, at which it's typically held in May. So for a company that has a December 31st calendar, typically you'll see that the annual meeting is held in May or June. New members are elected, and key decisions are taken around the audit committee in terms of appointing the auditor for the ensuing year. There are major proposals made by various stockholders, and it's the meeting which galvanizes the governance process of the board. After the annual meeting concludes, typically there is a board meeting at which that is the one meeting of the year that I think you'll find that most board members will tell you they decompress a little bit, unless it's gone badly, which in most cases it hasn't. But to the extent that the board meeting has gone pretty much as scripted, the meetings that follow the annual general meeting, the board meetings that is, tend to be a little bit less pressure tested. But the one after that, the one that's held in September. So they're typically for a board, there are 4 meetings a year. Sometimes they're 5, sometimes they're more, sometimes they're 6. But typically 4 is the number that I see, and they're held in September, December, February, and in May or June after the annual meeting. The September meeting is the strategy meeting. It's process for the nomination of new directors for the ensuing year. And so the September meeting is typically off-site. It can be, where the management team and the board will go to a venue that provides a quiet, kind of contemplative atmosphere, gives the board members a chance to talk about long-term strategy and anything else that really has any sort of long-term implications on the operations. Following the September meeting, well, I should back up. So one other element of the September meeting, I mentioned it, was the nominating process. Normally, the nominating process is part of the agenda for the September meeting, in that people are looking at the slate of directors that currently sit at the table and trying to figure out, some volunteer that they're going to either be retiring off the board, resigning off the board, or there may be gaps in competencies, cybersecurity, or some other clinical affairs. There may be some gaps that need to be addressed. So the nominating committee chair and the board chair typically will use that forum as an opportunity to also assess the composition of the board and put into motion a decision to expand the board, typically not contract the board, or simply refresh the board with some new faces. The December meeting is really built around the preparation for compensation recommendations, performance reviews of the leadership team, and the promotion decisions, as well as SEC filings, which will ensue in the next meeting in late January, February. So the end of the fourth quarter meeting is focusing on, again, how much do we pay our leadership team? Are we satisfied with the performance of our chief executive officer? The promotion decisions are ones in restructuring or reorganization of an organization might occur at that point in time if it makes sense. And the SEC filings have begun to be thought about because they're due in the first quarter of the ensuing year. So by the time February comes, which would be the meeting typically that is held prior to the annual general meeting, the compensation decisions are finalized. The auditor's report is released. The 10K is filed in March. The annual meeting notice and proxy statement is mailed. So everything is in motion now to convene the annual meeting, which, as I said earlier, held in typically May or June. So there's a rhythm to the process. The board gets, frankly, somewhat accustomed to the rhythm. There may be exceptions, as I mentioned, where you have externalities, events that could not have been foreseen that are going to create chaos or other pressures. So there are going to be many phone calls in between these meetings, many phone calls, especially at the committee level. But these are the sort of the core meetings around which business is formally conducted. And I should say, and Jim will talk about this in a minute when he talks about the role. And I'll piggyback on what I know Jim's going to talk about is the preparation involved. You should never underestimate the amount of time and preparation that's involved in attending these sessions. or in the readings that are sent around, or phone calls or Zoom calls or what have you that are convened in intervening periods. It's an enormous commitment, and you should not take it lightly. So I'll conclude my little segment by saying that the board service opportunity is really one that enables you to make a contribution as well as gain what I would consider to be invaluable insights into how to run a business and how to problem solve, and will give you points of comparison to your own business, which are extraordinarily valuable. But hopefully will also provide access to other accomplished executives, their wisdom and their networks. And so it's a rich experience. It's an expansive experience. It's not without its challenges. But with that, I'll turn it over now to Jim and Bob, unless you want to say a few words. Jim, over to you.
No, I think let's turn it over to Jim, and that was awesome. Thank you, John.
Okay, thank you, Bob. Thank you, John, and good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to meet and a privilege to have the opportunity to talk with all of you. So I'll try to be brief, and hopefully we'll have a little discussion at the end. I would put my remarks in two, let's say, parts. The first is why, be a director, and then the second is what does a director do? And I think the first is very important, and I would really encourage you to think about why you would want to do it. As John highlighted one element, which is I think it can be a great professional development, a great opportunity to learn, to see an enterprise-wide perspective and how all the pieces are brought together in forming a strategy. But I would only join a board. I would encourage you to really think about the board you might join, and only join a board where you feel a real sense of passion for the mission of the company and a real sense of alignment with the CEO and the other directors and their values. Because, it's an all-in kind of experience. It should be an all-in kind of experience. It's not just about the money. It's about becoming part of a journey, part of a mountaineering expedition where you're trying to summit, and you're part of the team that's summiting, and you can't let your team down in the middle of the mission. And I think, it's only really worth the time if you have that sense of being kind of inspired. The only thing is things are not going to go according to plan. The strategy is going to change. The leadership team is going to change. And the board is going to play a very important role in guiding those changes and hopefully guiding them to a successful, resolution for the benefit of shareholders and other stakeholders, whether they be patients in the case of many companies or whoever the other beneficiaries of the company's products are. So I think that's the first thing I would say is really think about, having a sense of mission and passion for what you're doing, that you should feel energized by the companies whose board you join. It's not just a job. So the role, I would put the role briefly into three parts, and John touched on some of them. The first, I would say, which is much of what John covered, is what I would call the formal governance role. And the formal governance role is executed through the 4 meetings a year that John described. I think you should plan each of those to be 2 days. The second day would be pretty much a full day meeting, but the first day is the preparation, either the day before or days before. There is a deck, and many of you have participated in preparing these, I'm sure, in your own companies. It's not uncommon to get a 50, 60, 80 slide deck that's dense with material. And I think every board member should be expected to have been through the briefing book in advance of the meeting and be prepared. The meeting is not to go through the slides. The meeting is to discuss the issues raised in the slides. If you haven't been through them, you can't participate. So between committees and decks and board materials, I think you should think about a 2 full day per quarter engagement for the formal governance process, including probably 1 committee. The second, I would say, regular ongoing part is, I would call it informal, but it's very important. And it's about, contributing to the strategy and the development of the team, the development of the CEO, the C-suite, thinking strategically about the company, thinking, it's often said about a board member that a board member should learn to think like the CEO, but not act like the CEO. And thinking about what is in the best interest of the company, that's done between meetings. And that's an hour call here and there, often with the CEO. Often each director will line up with 1 member of the C-suite, depending on your own experience, with the chief commercial officer, the chief operating officer, the chief financial officer, the chief medical officer. And between the CEO and your, let's say, your point of contact, I think you should plan that between meetings, there will be several hours, once every, couple of weeks. You'll have an hour or 2 with that individual, again, coaching, mentoring, reacting to new developments, advising, making connections. So that's at least another, I would say, full day, a quarter of, ongoing activity. And then the third element, which again, John alluded to, is the episodic, and as John said, reaction in some ways, either to a crisis, as John said, an adverse event in a clinical trial or with a product, or any other kind of adverse event, factory shutdown or whatever kind of disaster may strike a company, sexual harassment, negative publicity, you're on the front page of the Wall Street Journal, or as John said, an activist shareholder makes a run at the company is so-called in play. And again, you're in the papers every day. And when that happens, for a period of time, the board is kind of on call, and the board can be convening, typically not every day, but a couple of days a week actively for what could be a few weeks, could be a few months. And it's very important, I think, that you talk with your CEOs and that they understand and support, number one, that this can be a great professional development opportunity for you and enhance your ability to contribute to the companies you're in today, but that also they need to understand and accept it's going to take this time, both regular and episodic, and hopefully, they're prepared to support that for your sake and the sake of the companies that you're getting involved in. So I'll stop there. As we talked about earlier, I'm sure there's a lot of interesting questions and I look forward to them, and I'll just maybe end my remarks there. And I will turn it over now to Jay, unless Bob was going to say something. I'm going to turn it over to Jay for the final set of comments.
Yeah, Jim, before we jump in there's one thing during our discussion that just really, really resonated with me. And that was most of the folks on this call are pharmaceutical executives right now aspiring to board level roles. And many of the questions that I've received is, do you think I have enough time to serve on a board and hold down a full-time job? I thought your perspective as a chairman of 3 biotechs and discussing with their CEO as a development piece was something that really, really resonated. Could you take 2 minutes and just explain that? Because I thought it was incredibly relevant and insightful.
Sure. I think companies today, I think it's becoming best practice in what are considered, well-run, well-respected companies. Those companies are increasingly accepting and recognizing that it's great professional development opportunity for their C-suite type executives, rising star executives, to serve on an outside board, because it is a great professional development opportunity. And if they don't provide it, they will not be able to retain and recruit and retain the best talent. And they also recognize that it's very helpful to their companies to have somebody else in the company who understands how a board works and is seeing that enterprise-wide mentality. But it's very important, as I think I said to Bob earlier, when we're recruiting directors who have full-time jobs, I always ask to speak to their CEOs, to speak to the CEO personally and say, look, we know this person has a full-time job by definition is, as an overflowing plate, but we need to understand that you're supportive of within reason. And of course, if your own company is facing a crisis, that has to be your first priority. But barring that on a regular ongoing basis, the CEO recognizes that it's important to his company or his or her company to develop executives and offer this opportunity, and is going to be supportive of your taking on that role.
Yeah, that was incredibly insightful and very much resonating with me. So thank you, Jim, very much. And we'll transition now to Jay.
Great. Well, thanks, everyone. Jim, John, Bob, appreciate the opportunity to speak with the group today, and certainly nodding my head a lot to the comments that have been made already as they resonate with me personally. A couple things I thought would be helpful to cover in addition to what's already been said. So one is this concept we were just talking about related to the value that board experience can bring. So I joined my first board when I was still at Merck, and I was really struck right away by how seeing perspective from a different lens in a different industry or related industry enabled me to bring valuable insights back to my day job. So it wasn't just career development for me. I felt like I was actually better equipped to do the role that I had at Merck at the time, due to the exposure that I was getting outside of the walls, if you will. Organizations tend to be pretty insular, and leaders in those organizations, particularly large organizations, tend to be internally focused as a result. And so getting out of the walls and seeing, kind of how things are done in other institutions, I think is a hugely valuable learning. So I'm a big fan of board experience, obviously, and I encourage everyone who is here who has interest in gaining some to fulfill it. That said, I think there are some very important considerations. One was mentioned earlier: you have to have passion about the board that you're joining. I think that's absolutely right, and I think it's kind of a nice opportunity to get involved in something that you have passion about, if it's not your day job, or if there's something else that you have interest in beyond your day job that you feel passionate or excited about. Board experience is a great way to have an affiliation with an organization that you can get excited about, and still keep your day job. But I think as you think about where you would like to get this experience, there are some practical considerations which came up around time commitment, et cetera. Early advice that I got was think about geography really carefully. If you're on the East Coast and the board you're looking at or being recruited for is on the West Coast, that 2-day every quarter is now 3 or 4 days every quarter when you tack on the travel. Same is true for international boards, by the way. Occasionally there'll be an Irish company, let's say, that needs or some other European-based company. Think about that carefully. And think about the time commitment that's going to be required. The other thing that I think is important right up front is to get a good sense of what the expectations are on the part of the chairman of the board and the other board members around number of committees that you would serve on. So we haven't talked about committees yet. I'd like to come back to that in just a minute, because I think committees are a key function, and all committees are not created equally by any means. So if they want you to sit on audit, you probably can't do any other committee, for example. And most new board members I've found are asked to sit on the audit committee. It's pretty intense, and you need to read everything. And so, expect that and realize that's pretty normal. If you're new to a board and they ask you to sit on the audit committee, it's a great way to learn the company, but it requires a lot of focus and a lot of attention. On the other hand, the other committees that are typical, we see kind of an exec comp usually. We see what would be kind of considered a nomination and governance committee, that's tasked with identifying new board members and kind of the practice of the board and the practice of the leadership of the company. Those committees can be really fun to be on. I've had the advantage of chairing an exec comp committee and understanding the mechanics around how compensation is structured in various entities, particularly public companies, and the benchmarks and kind of conventional practice and how outliers are handled and these kinds of things, I think is really interesting. And as an executive myself, I learned a lot in the process of kind of going through that. So, don't just think about joining the board as being a member of the board. You're really going to be probably even first and foremost a member of the committee or committees that you're assigned to. Because that's where most of the work gets done, frankly. And the day, my experience has been, as I think Jim mentioned, the day before the board meetings are typically, I've seen frequently, they typically are committee meetings. So you board members come in a day or two early. The committees meet in advance of the board meeting. A lot of the work gets done, the sausage making, the real interrogation, the questions of management, and suggestions to management get done in those committees, not in the general board meeting that occurs kind of on the last day. And then the last comment that I'll make is just around the type of board. So we've been speaking a lot about public company boards, and public company boards are really interesting from my perspective, because there's a defined fiduciary and governance obligation with personal liability, frankly, for board members who don't fulfill those expectations. So it's a very it's a heavy role in that regard. But there are other types of entities that also have great board experience opportunities, and I found those to be as enriching as some of the for-profits. And I'm talking specifically here about non-for-profits. Non-for-profit boards in academic related institutions, non-for-profit boards in healthcare. I sit on a board of a large healthcare system in New Jersey, 35,000 employees. It's a big entity, and that's super gratifying, because in our industry, in pharmaceuticals, we tend to be, in biotech, we tend to be so far up the food chain that to also see what's happening on the front lines of healthcare as a patient shows up sick for care, and understanding the dynamics of all of that has been hugely insightful for me to kind of connect the dots in what we're doing when we're, creating medicines that are 4, 5, 8 years, 10 years away from seeing the front lines and actually helping patients. So healthcare systems, great opportunity. I think I'm also a big fan of kind of community responsibility. I think local nonprofits in the areas where you live or where your company is based, especially as an executive at a larger company or prominent company, I think it's the right way to signal willingness to give back and serve the community in every way. Some of the nonprofit boards clarity around expectations are really important. If your goal is to contribute materially to the governance and organization of the nonprofit, and you're prepared to make yourself available to do that, great. On the other hand, some board members of nonprofits there's an expectation that their role is really to contribute financially to the organization, and that may be your best way to contribute, frankly, if you don't have the time, but you still want to be part of it. So understanding, how you're going to be able to contribute and getting alignment around that up front, I think is important to do. But particularly with the nonprofits, there are options around level of involvement. So maybe I'll stop there and make sure we have enough time for Q&A. We can dig into any of this more, more directly if anyone has specific questions. So thanks.
Jay, that was excellent. And I really like the part about the nonprofits, because many of the folks on the call, the first chance you get to get some board participation and board experience is finding something you're passionate about and volunteering your time to get on a board. And one of the things that John impressed upon me on our call back in December was that many times you may have a nonprofit with anywhere from 6 to 20 people, but in nonprofits, many times it's 2 or 3 people that are doing 80% of the work, which is hopefully a little different than the private and public sector. So it goes back to what Jim said. You really need to be passionate about the organization you're supporting. So I think those are great insights, and really appreciate you sharing as well. I do think it's a great time. The favorite part of these sessions for me are the Q&A, because it's relevant to the folks that have taken the time out of their day to ask the questions of our thought leaders. So what I'd instruct anybody on the phone to do, if you have a question for the Killer Jays, please go ahead and text your question to Will Pisano. He will vet the questions, and we will get folks teed up. And I know there was a couple questions coming in on chat as we were going. So Will, I'm not sure if we have any questions ready yet, or if we need a minute to get things.
We do. And Alan Salter, I believe, did I lose him? Alan,
No, I'm
there?
here.
I believe you've got a question. There you go.
Yeah, I do. So, hey guys, Alan Salter, currently actually work in the pharmaceutical industry myself. I'm on the procurement team for Takeda Pharmaceuticals. I'm also the chairman of the board of a nonprofit that is focused on veterans and military here in the Chicagoland area. My question for you guys, and I think I'll start with Jim, because Jim kind of brought it up, was really around, when you think about the conversations that you're having with the management teams around, mentoring and things like that, what else do you really talk about when you get into those conversations? And, what are you trying to tell them, and what are you trying to glean from them so you can give them more input and things like that? I think it was a really interesting way to get started with that, because as I think about what I do, I have 5 we have 5 paid employees in our board, and I need to understand what we need to do with them as well. So I'm interested to see how this plays out. So Jim, if you can start us off, I'd appreciate it.
Well, that's a good broad question. And I think it obviously varies a lot around every different situation. But if I were to try to maybe put some general characteristics on it, I would say, one level is around what you might call personal and professional development, and it's coaching and mentoring the individual in terms of their own effectiveness and their leadership of the team as you're observing it and getting feedback on it. And the other is about the strategy of the organization. And, companies get somebody, I think Jay said, people become very internally focused. Companies get very focused on execution, and execution is critical. 80 to 90% of what a company needs to do is execute, but 10 to 20% needs to be stepping back and thinking about, is that the right strategy? And how has the world changed? How have we changed? How have external forces changed? And helping them get that external perspective and think about, are there ways that we should rethink what the company's doing that, it's hard. It's like when you're draining the out of the swamp, right? You forget why you came in the first place. And to really step back a little bit, help the team step back and think more broadly about, are these the right priorities, or should we, be pivoting or transitioning our priorities in some important ways?
No, that's great. If I could do one follow on, Jim, if you don't mind. When you think about the weight that you carry into that conversation, how much persuasion do you really get, or how much persuasion over them do you get as a board member as you're doing your mentoring and your recommendations and things like that?
It's funny you asked that. I feel like I have to earn it every day, and I have to be at my best every day. And my goal every day is to earn the respect and, the support, the appreciation of the people I work with. So I work very hard to be very thoughtful about, trying to offer useful input and perspective. And I don't think it's not my job to tell anybody what to do. So I set myself the goal of trying to understand them and their aspirations well enough, offer them feedback that they find useful and actionable. And I sometimes I fail, but sometimes it's very rewarding when you can tell when somebody's really listened to something you said and it's had an impact. That's what makes it really all worthwhile.
No, that's awesome, Jim. I appreciate that. And I guess if Jay and John, if you guys don't mind, would you guys want to weigh in on those, on that question as well?
Sure, happy to. Do you want to go first, John, or?
No, go ahead, Jay, you got it.
Yeah, I think I agree with everything that Jim just said. I mean, it's been my experience also. I do feel like you have to earn it. Just because you're a board member coming into a company, there's maybe a cachet that you expect that comes with that. But the reality is, you're not running the company by any means, and you shouldn't be. And the influence that the board has ultimately is in this hiring and evaluation of the CEO, and the CEO reports to the board, but the employees report to the CEO. So I think that if there's genuine interest in, particularly among C-suite executives in the company that you're on the board of, if there's genuine interest in your insight or advice or perspective, then it's productive. On the other hand, if it's forced, if you try to force it, or if someone else tries to force it, I found that it can be a lot of energy for not much result. And so, I think that understanding where the boundaries are and, kind of what your role is as a board member is really important. And then if somebody, seeks out the advice, then by all means, you're trying to make yourself available. It could, there's also another angle to the question, which is, well, what happens when, as a board member, you're uncomfortable with the direction management's taking, or you don't necessarily agree. And then, that to me is a discussion among the board. Most board meetings have executive sessions. They should if they don't. And it's in those sessions that board members, a good chair of a board will ask each board member, how are you feeling about things? Is there anything that's bothering you here? Is there anything we should talk about? To try to understand and debate, whether any discussion with the CEO is required. And that's just good practice. But that's where those issues should be raised, and a strategy to bring them up. To me, it works best when it's a strategy that the board comes up with collectively and agrees to, rather than individual board members taking that on themselves. So hope that's useful.
That's great. Thanks, Jay. I appreciate it.
And now what I'd add to that is really brief, but I think, with respect to board and Jim bringing his A game every day, as he talks about, I mean, boards are assessed these days as our managers. I mean, it's not unusual now for a board to have a standing process to assess the effectiveness of its member directors. So, that doesn't chill many of the board members. They've got resumes and self-confidence and track records that build great respect in most cases. However, there is peer pressure to perform and to really step up and do a good job. So I think that you can take some comfort in knowing that these are not people that just are walking in, cashing a check or collecting stock options in your business without actually feeling that they have a strong fiduciary responsibility to the business. The other thing I would say relative to mentorship is cultural. I think that the companies where senior executives are known to be supportive culturally of the idea of mentoring younger executives, I think it makes the proposition much less threatening to all. And so I think that depending upon the company in which you currently operate or some of the others on this call today, I think it really gets down to culture, and it starts at the top. Does the CEO take interest in and help promote his direct reports and the direct reports of the direct reports in advancing their careers in this way? So I'll stop there.
No, that's great. Yeah, I was gonna say thank you all. Sorry, Bob.
No, Alan, thank you very much. Appreciate it. Great question and appreciate the responses. It's nice to see you, Alan. Will, I think Tony Coniglio.
Yeah, Tony's got a really good question. If you're not a CEO or not a CFO, how do you get selected? So Tony, you're unmuted now. If you can speak to the team.
Thanks, Will and Bob, and it's great to connect. And John Hawkins in particular, great to see you.
Hey, Tony.
How are you? So, Mike, broader, just to amplify, there's obviously some logical choices for board members, particularly on public pharma companies, of ex-CEOs or even current CEOs, CFOs. But what about like the next level down and kind of executive director or VP of marketing or business development licensing, and even on the R&D side? Are there opportunities for those folks? And what might be scenarios where you can imagine, or your experience has been, type of company, stage of development, et cetera, or functional needs? So I just appreciate if you get some perspective. I suspect a lot of people on this video fall into that category, not exactly at that top level, but are very interested.
Well,
I'm happy
one-
to start.
ahead, Jim.
I do a lot of recruiting. I'm sure John's done more recruiting than anybody. But I would say of a typical board, if you look at a typical 7 or 9 person board, there might be 2 or 3 of those people might be current or former CEOs, but the majority are not. The majority are people who have, who've been C-level executives in some function. And typically, boards you often use, and John's probably developed this, what they call a capabilities matrix. And you look at, what does the company need? What skills does it need? And if let's take a biotech company or, a startup that's being started, there's going to be there'll be 1 or 2 CEOs on the board, but there might be a scientist, there might be a physician. And then as the company matures a little bit, there'll almost always be a former CFO who chair the audit committee. As the company gets near product launch, sometimes they bring on a commercial person or they bring on a general manager. So I think it's kind of a stage of development thing. But the key, I think, is that what people look for in boards like that is they look for somebody with deep functional experience, but also the ability to think broadly. Even though you may have been in one function, to have the perspective of thinking about building the company. So that's why I think Jay's point about being on a nonprofit board, or, many of your companies invest in small companies where they get board seats or board observer roles even. Anything you can do to develop that broad, horizontal, enterprise-wide perspective to go along with the deep functional expertise, that's what really makes an outstanding board member. Sorry, John.
No, I think you nailed it. I was going to add the last bit, which is Tony, which I think I'll just say it maybe a slightly different way, but not a lot. I mean, I see plenty of younger executives who have gotten involved in very early stage companies. So these are private companies. These are not public companies, but these are maybe someday going to be public companies. Right. And so things that, you ought to be thinking about is trying to hitch your wagon to companies where you may know the principals or the investors or others, and using that as a way to build. So I'll stop there.
No, that's very helpful. I usually tell people I replaced John Hawkins once in my career, and that's a big Thank you both very much.
Okay, Tony.
What Tony, doesn't tell you, he's got a size 22 feet because they were pretty big shoes to fill. So
I didn't say I filled them. I took the job.
Tony, thank you very, very much for that. It was a great question. And I think it was something that was also touched on back in December. Barbara Ryan, who was a lead analyst for Deutsche Bank, was on our call, and she pointed to the fact that most companies hadn't thought about her as an analyst or as a board member because of her role as an analyst. But once she started talking to the chairman and the CEOs of other companies, especially those that had a desire to go public, her deep level subject matter expertise was recognized, and she quickly was put on several boards. So, I think it was a great question, Tony. Really appreciate it. So thank you very much. Will?
Right. So George Escrow's got a question, and George, I've just unmuted you, and hopefully you can come online.
Yeah, good afternoon.
Camera 2, please, George. If you
Well-
can. Go ahead.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Well, I
Go ahead. That's fine. Go ahead.
get on camera in a second. There we go. Yeah, the question that I had was related to mainly to the difference in characteristics of board members you look for in private organizations versus public, if there is any, John, Jay, or Jim. Are the characteristics, the traits you look for in those individuals similar, or are they very different? Or is it a mix?
Who wants to?
Good, Jay.
Yeah, all right. Well, so I think they are a little bit different in my experience. Generally, as I mentioned earlier, because of the requirements, regulatory requirements to serve on a public board, that the type of person who's comfortable with that type of rigor and personal exposure. Now, one of the questions you ask is about D&O insurance, so you don't feel too personally exposed, but you are responsible, and and that's a legal kind of thing. It's not something to be taken lightly, and so I think the folks that generally tend to be comfortable serving on public boards have either been on one previously, or they're familiar with the increased level of rigor. That's really, it's not that you don't have the same level of rigor with a private company at all. That's not what I'm trying to communicate here. It's that the regulatory process is so regimented and so prescribed, in a public company, and there's a lot of time that's spent on that as a result. So I think that's one area where it's different. The other is my experience has been that generally privately held companies are smaller and earlier. Not always, but generally. And as a result, some of the things that they need early on, particularly in pharma and biotech, is, for example, really, it's around earlier stage development. It's around heavy scientific focus and scientific acumen. It's not the kinds of things that come later, where regulatory becomes more important, manufacturing, supply chain become more important, commercial becomes more important. And so I think that's a difference as well. Again, not all private companies are early, but most of them, in my experience, are. And I think for that reason, there's a little bit of a different characteristic, required, in that context.
Thank you.
I would add to that, George. I mean, it's sort of maybe self-evident, but in the not-for-profit world, having chaired and sat on a few myself, you're people looking for you to write a check. So the financial commitment is in the for-profit world. Of course, you can acquire equity in the firm. That's the way it works there, or be granted options or restricted stock. But in the not-for-profit world, no surprise. I mean, you're going to be asked to contribute to the enterprise. So, your competencies to the table.
Yeah, I totally agree with John on that point. Although I'll say in my nonprofit experience, in some cases, we've had agreement that the value I bring is, will be related to the work that I'm going to do, or the, the insights that I'll bring to the organization. And again, being clear about that up front. There's generally always some level of expectation in a nonprofit that you're financially contributing to the organization, but that the size of that contribution can vary depending on the other ways that you can contribute, personally.
Really helpful, guys. Thank you.
George, great question. Thank you very, very much. Appreciate it. Will, I think Stacy has a question.
We do. And Stacy, you're unmuted. And if you can turn your camera on and your microphone on, the floor is yours.
Hey, well, thank the camera today. some reason. So I'll just ask the question. So thank you all very much for sharing your insights. I'm wondering, as a current board member about to welcome a new CEO from outside of our organization, I'd love to hear any recommendations you have about assimilation programs that a board can support and suggest to bring a new CEO on to be as effective as quickly as possible.
Great question.
It is a great question. Stacy, I actually was involved with several client firms over the course of my career that had this issue raised. And one of the ideas that someone came up, I actually was down the road and writing a book on assimilating a new CEO into a business, is actually went and interviewed 20 or 30 board chairs who had been engaged in bringing in new chief executives in the prior year. And so one of the things that I learned is that the experience that can be gathered out there in the marketplace from other boards who will share with you their indoctrination processes, their assimilation processes, and things that they did, not just in terms of the HR team, but in terms of the board and how it would embrace the newcomer and how it would just sort of set the tone with the newcomer. And it's a very complicated process. It's not something you can just snap your fingers and have a cookbook to do it. But one of the things that I would advise you to consider is having a task force or someone who would have the time to devote to really understanding best practices that are out there, because most of the firms that I worked with were relatively open with respect to how they went about it. I mean, it wasn't some deep, dark, guarded secret. In fact, in most cases, they were quite proud of it, and they made efforts to describe the first 60 to 100 days of the onboarding process with the new CEO. So I'd offer that just as a suggestion.
It's a critical moment, obviously, particularly if as you're saying, you're bringing someone in from the outside. It's a very high risk moment. The future of the company is, it's very much a pivotal moment. And I think reflecting that, it's worth taking a lot of time to think about it. And I would say, in addition to the thing John said, thinking about processes that encourage, really, I would say, in-depth, immersion with the CEO and the management team and the board. John talked about kind of 2-day offsite type retreats. And I think encouraging the CEO to take the time to really step back with the management team and the board to build relationships, to build culture, and a shared understanding before kind of diving in is time very, very well spent for the long term.
Yeah, the only thing that I would add, two quick comments, I guess. One is most board member, we didn't talk about this yet, but the idea of continuing education for board members is a really good one. I think particularly on a public company board, if it's not required, it's a good idea to take the initiative to do some routine CE work, like what we're talking about here. There are other organizations that support board members nationally, and those organizations frequently have access to resources around things like new board member assimilation or new CEO assimilation. And so, I think that would be a source of resource for you. And then the other question is, is the CEO coming on also joining the board? Because that's important as well. A lot of times that is the case. So you're not just assimilating the CEO into the role, but you're assimilating them onto the board as well. And that's another consideration.
Thank you all. Really helpful. Thank you.
Stacy, great question. I really appreciate it. And great insights from the team as well, because as Jim said, it's an incredibly pivotal moment for any company. So I love that question. Will, I think Rodney Gillespie.
Rodney Gillespie's got a very good question about your CV. Do you present it differently for your employment versus a board? So Rodney, if you can turn on your controls, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thanks, Will. And thanks everybody for the great insight. Definitely appreciate it. I was wondering more from like a CV perspective, probably two parts to this question. One, should you have a CV that's very specific if you're trying to get on a board that is, very relatable for that type of role versus you going after, your senior level type of role that you would have normally? And then as a part of that, how important is it and does it play a role if you sit on maybe a nonprofit, and does that experience help you in terms of getting onto a for-profit board as well? Thanks.
Rodney, I've looked at thousands of resumes and documents from board seekers, and the best advice I would give you is to have two documents. The first is a bio. So develop a 1-page, maybe 2-page bio that highlights your life, your career, the things that you consider important to your development and who you are as a person. And use that as the introductory document that you approach businesses, recruiters, whomever you're in contact with, as a way to introduce yourself. And if the conversation ripens, have a CV that you can provide that would provide the salient details behind the narrative. That typically is how it's done at the highest levels. I mean, when pick one. When Jamie Dimon goes out and looks for a board seat, nobody's asking him for a CV, right? I mean, they want to see, at the max, maybe a short narrative of maybe it's a 1-pager. It synopsizes who you are, and then but do be prepared to have the other document as a backup should it be needed.
Yeah, I think John naturally has a very good point about the bio. Keep it simple. I would say in line with that, as John kind of alluded to, and as you obviously know, a lot of it, obviously the networking and the personal relationships are the key, right? And so one thing that we didn't really mention because we weren't so much focused on getting on boards, but Jay kind of alluded to it. If you think about the two groups of now, if you put aside nonprofits, if you talk about for-profit boards for a moment, there are really two groups there that we touched on earlier, private companies and public companies. And if you think about board member selection, you can put them in two general buckets, I would say. Board members on private companies are generally selected by venture capitalists and by the firms, the syndicates that have invested the money, and had their own members on as the founding board members. So getting to know the venture community, maybe through your business development teams or through other relationships, getting to know the leaders of the venture community, those are the best people to get to know in terms of private board opportunities. Public boards are typically done through search firms. Again, John was one of the best, but there are, there's no more than about half a dozen firms that do the great majority of what you might call, A-list board searches. And, your companies probably use them. You may use them for other purposes, getting to know them, getting to know the people in those firms who recruit for boards and in the right way, expressing your interest. I think those are the ways to really get your bio in front of the right people with the right endorsement.
Thank you both. Appreciate that.
Great, Rodney. Great question. Great to see you. Hope the family's doing well.
Thanks, Bob. Same here.
So I've got a question that's going to come across as an anonymous question from one of the viewers, and it's for Jim. And it's specifically around the activist position on a board. So in the pharmaceutical world, there are times when activists will take a position on a public pharmaceutical company's board, and all of a sudden there is a flurry of activity at the board level to try to answer questions, position the organization, etc. Can you talk a little bit more about the time commitment? Because as this individual noted, there appears to be significantly more requests to the management team in this period of time as well, feeding information up to the C-suite and the CEO and the board. So with that as a background, Jim, I don't know, and John and Jay, if you've got insights as well, but I know, Jim, you mentioned it earlier, so I thought I'd start with you.
Yeah, that can really change the dynamics on a board. Boards tend to be very collaborative, consensual. Very few board decisions are taken by a formal vote. They're almost always reached by consensus until an activist joins, in which case, that's not always the case. I would say there's a spectrum of activists, and they range from people who are pretty constructive and want to help and engage constructively, with the board. And then there are others who are much more, in a sense, hostile and even adversarial. And which end of the spectrum you're on has a big impact. if you're on the latter end, you're still kind of playing defense in some ways there. Somebody's on the board, but you still haven't embraced them and you're kind of working around them to a degree. In the former, you're trying to engage them much more. But yes, I think the amount of material, let's say the preparation level definitely goes up, because the CEO, the board, you talked about being at the top of your game before, you really need to be at the top of your game when you've got somebody who's looking for weakness and mistakes and openings. And so I think it's important for the senior leadership team and the board members who are aligned with them to informally make sure that they think very actively about how do you manage the activists. And then, there's a formal session, but there's more pre-wiring done to prepare for those sessions, I think, when you have somebody like that, on board.
Oh, great insights. Thank you very much, Jim. John or Jay, anything to add to that?
Well, I mean, as you know, I helped Valiant when they were going through their problems and repopulating their board, and had exposure to Value Act and Pershing Square Capital, who both had seats on that board. And they were more in the former category that Jim talked about. I mean, they were extremely constructive in some respects. I mean, they weren't afraid to speak their mind, but they were in the sort of towards the front end of the category that Jim talked about, where they were trying to turn it into a successful business and do the right thing. I think that's the watchword right there is where do they fall on that continuum, and you can sort of predict the outcome accordingly. I'll leave it with that.
I appreciate that very, very much, John. Looking at the clock right now, we are at 5:30 Eastern, 2:30 Pacific, and I do want to be respectful of everybody's time. I truly appreciate the folks that joined the call. I know it's during the middle of the workday. We will make this available on our website via the recording available. But I once again, I really want to thank John, Jim, and Jay for taking the time out of their incredibly busy schedules to join us. And I do want to note that with regards to John and Jim in particular, they're big fans of the late Henry Tamir, who was a icon of our industry and did really put the rare disease products on the map and have helped millions and millions of people. John has written a book around biography around Henry Tamir, which is fantastic. And Jim's got a book coming out that I'm eager to read. So I just want to get those plugs in there as well. Three titans of our industry joining us today, and I really appreciate it. So thank you, gentlemen, very much. And thank you, Will and Al, for setting this up.
Thank you, Bob. Nice to see you, everyone.
Thanks, Bob, for organizing this, and great to be with you guys on this. Thanks a lot.
Yes, thank you all. Very well done.
Hey, Brian, thank you.
Thank you, guys.
You guys.
Bye now.
Good night.
Good night.